And it's a mystery.
Welcome to the Blue Rose Task Force podcast, where we look deeply into Twin Peaks as a whole, one episode at a time, using the full scope of the show Twin Peaks and all of its media. We don't use the word canon, but we do consider all official releases important because Lynch and Frost have approved their presence. And we welcome all input into the collective consciousness that is the Twin Peaks community.
So this podcast is a watch-along podcast for those who've seen all of Twin Peaks, Season 1, Season 2, Fire Walk With Me, and Season 3, aka The Return, which we're going to consider as we go along and how it impacts the previous seasons. So today we're looking at the first overall episode of Twin Peaks, the pilot, often known as Season 1, Episode 1, but also known as Northwest Passage in the German regionalization, or Episode 0, which can get confusing. I am your host, Elle.
And I'm your host, John. In the Twin Peaks pilot, Pete Martell discovers the body of Laura Palmer, and the seismic grief of events ripples through the whole town for a full half hour before battered and near catatonic Ronette Pulaski crosses a bridge and triggers the involvement of Kyle MacLachlan's best TV character of all time contender, Special Agent Dale Cooper. Cooper and Sheriff Truman investigate evidence as we see it acquired, most notably from the Palmer house and the train car, and they question a number of townsfolk. While they do this, said townsfolk make their own plans, many of whom converge at the Roadhouse at 9:30 p.m. despite the curfew Cooper instated during a town meeting, and the day's chaotic energy explodes into a brawl. Things lead to other things, and Sarah Palmer ends the episode having an upsetting vision in her house of the heart necklace James and Donna just buried in the woods being dug up by a suspicious gloved hand. Okay, so now that we're reacquainted with the plot of the episode, what kind of questions are we actually left with?
Well, we're left with the question, what kind of presence is Laura Palmer? Who doesn't need to be told that Laura has died or that it was her that was the victim? What exactly is going on with Sarah Palmer and the Palmer house? Are there signs, even at this early stage, of other timelines or frequencies? What is it about mirrors? Is Dale already in the Red Room? And how does delusion relate to the reality of Twin Peaks?
Yeah, so that's a big mouthful. I'm sure we could just solve all of it before the end of this, right?
Let's give it a good go.
Okay, so now we're going to take a look behind the curtain and actually plant everything in historical context of what actually happened, because there's a lot of people that think David Lynch did absolutely everything, and it turns out it was actually a big group effort, and there's a lot of who's where and doing what at what time that could use with a little bit of a clarification.
Absolutely.
So in 1985, Lynch and Frost met through their mutual agent, Tony Krantz. You would kind of wonder, like, Lynch is this surrealist. He's, he had a pretty solid reputation by that point. And what he had anything to do with for like why Tony Krantz would have thought that the guy who was like the big story editor on Hill Street Blues for about 3 years would have anything to do with David Lynch and working. It doesn't seem like a good match up front, but Frost is a Jungian, and the more that I look into Carl Jung, it's all about dream interpretation, and it really explains a quote from Tony Krantz in Reflections, An Oral History of Twin Peaks by Brad Dukes. Krantz said that David had this vision that Mark could grab a hold of. And yeah, it just makes me think about dream interpretation.
I just wonder if there was some off-the-record night in a jazz bar or in a day in a coffee shop where Tony Krantz and Mark Frost got into the deep and meaningfuls about the universe, and he just thought, hang on, I know a guy who would love to have a cup of coffee with you and talk this through. So I do, in my mind, that's how I think they met.
I would not be shocked.
Yeah.
Yeah, so after Blue Velvet was already completed, Lynch and Frost did start writing together. The first thing they were working on was about a book called, they were going to adapt a book called Goddess, and that's about the final days of Marilyn Monroe. And at the time, she was like the iconic movie star. And the reason why it got canned is because at the end, they were, Lynch and Frost and the book all implied that the Kennedys were involved in her death. And at that point, the Kennedys were like I don't know exactly if saint is the right word because I was only, like about 10 at the time, but it seemed like, it's like Camelot, it's like the big thing.
They were like the royal family.
Yes.
Of
yeah.
the US.
It's very much like the royal family. And like, you can't imply them in the death of the biggest movie star of the time. So
it's not going to stop Dale Cooper wondering about it though.
Yeah. And it's not going to stop Lynch and Frost from trying to do it anyway, because they like to shake up the system any chance they get, and it was like right there in their first pairing.
And it's such a shame it didn't come to fruition because Jessica Lange was involved as Marilyn, and that peak Lange, with the Frost and Lynch special recipe would have been a very interesting project to see, but we might not be sat here today if that was the case.
That's true. And another one that got away is called One Saliva Bubble. That was one where Lynch and Frost actually wrote the script together, and it's like this really weird, like it had like lowbrow humor all over the place, and it also had a whole bunch of weirdness. And it's basically electricity strikes an airport when a whole bunch of people are in it. People are switching bodies, and sometimes there's like personalities nested inside other people, and like they like change their behaviors, and it reminds me of stuff that will show up later, like even Dougie in season 3, that kind of thing, like just nesting personalities in general became such a big thing for them. But it's really funny that it shows up in this comedy.
Well, you can see the strands of the kind of some roots that started to take, even though these projects didn't come to pass.
Yeah,
that for sure sounds like some Peaks energy.
Yeah. And that one was like 6 weeks away from shooting, and they had Steve Martin and Martin Short attached to it. It was going to be like this really classic, like oddball thing that would have been probably in line with Raising Arizona, except that De Laurentiis Entertainment went into a very quick bankruptcy, and like all the IP got shut off, and they couldn't access the rights anymore. So they they got burned on it, and they basically had to figure out what to do next. And Tony Krantz basically suggested that, why don't you look into television? So they write this thing called the Lemurians. And Krantz said Lemuria was sort of like Atlantis. It was considered a continent that vanished from the history of the Earth. And the Lemurians was a story about a bunch of FBI agents who used Geiger counters and other homemade detection devices to find Lemurians who were intent on rising up and taking over the Earth. Now, doesn't that FBI setup sound a little familiar?
Definitely rings a few bells, yes. And possibly even could come out after Twin Peaks in something called The X-Files, perhaps.
Yep, absolutely. And Brandon Tartikoff over at NBC actually bought this thing, and he was all ready to go with it, but he only wanted to make it a 2-hour movie instead of something that could keep going. And Lynch actually backed out of this one. He wanted something that could go longer. So, back to the drawing board one more time, and this time, Krantz says he suggested it, but I think it was probably organic between everybody that there's all these, like, all the people in Blue Velvet that weren't the main characters, write a soap opera about them. because
Mm.
soap operas, they go on forever. It's
Absolutely.
yeah. So that was basically the gist of what got Northwest Passage started, which was the original, or North Dakota, and then Northwest Passage. That's how the pitch got over to Chad Hoffman at ABC in August of 1988, and Hoffman, he already greenlit. Oh my gosh, he already greenlit 30 something and China Beach. So this guy's got credit, and
Mm-hmm.
he's just like entranced because David Lynch goes in there and he uses his hands and he's moving them. He's like, there's this town and there's this wind. I mean, it's like a highly mythologized story, but Frost even says, it's like, it's basically what he says it is. So like, I don't know if Lynch was actually casting a spell to make it happen, but but they basically said, you know what? It's crazy. We don't really get it, but write the script. This is interesting.
Yeah. And possibly, yeah, I think Frost would have really helped in that sense because they would have thought, okay, but
Yeah.
Hill Street Blues
Mhm.
guy, he's going to ground this.
Yeah, absolutely.
But still blows my mind that it was greenlit actually.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah,
It's great.
it blows everybody's mind. Yeah, it's like Lynch, she basically told Dwayne Dunham, it's like, they're never going to air this. Let's just have some fun.
Right. Yeah, maybe because they've been burnt a few times. They were like, let's just write whatever we want and see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they
changed history.
Mhm.
History of TV forever.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Yeah, but how to find a way into it? Well, Mark Frost had these. He figured. I mean, probably Hill Street Blues. I mean, crime investigation. He initially went to let's make it start out around the investigation of a murder, and he was remembering there was this unsolved murder back in upstate New York about a girl named Hazel Drew, and that's actually being written about right now. Or I mean, it's a book that's coming out in the next couple months. It's called Murder at Teal's Pond, and it's by David Bushman and Mark Givens, who both have Twin Peaks authorship background. David Bushman, he wrote Twin Peaks FAQ, and Mark Givens worked on Deer Meadow Radio, which is where I heard about it back in 2015. So I'm really excited to read the book. But then, in addition to that, Mark Frost also had, when he was growing up in California, there was a family acquaintance. One of their kids was murdered. So like he's kind of basing it around both of those kind of perspectives for how to get started with the story, and how they actually went about writing this. It's actually kind of crazy because season 3, well, they Skype together to write the season 3 script, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's actually kind of a back to starting positions because if you can believe it, Mark Frost had his it was oh god, it was like a really early edition of a Macintosh. And somebody figured out, like, back when only Usenet and probably academics types were on the internet, they figured out how to pipe his Macintosh from Los Angeles over to where David Lynch was staying in New York. And, like whatever Mark was typing on his screen was showing up over on David's screen, and like they're just talking on the phone talking about it. It's crazy to think that like that was happening even back then.
Yeah, that is great. Just back to the real life story, real life murder that inspired Twin Peaks. There is also a documentary, I believe, coming out called Blonde, Beautiful and Dead. So that's also something to look out for.
Yeah, and I think that is related to the book that Bushman and Givens were writing.
Yeah, it's gonna be
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, when that comes out, we will point you to it.
We will definitely point you to that. But I love, as you said, that Frost and Lynch were figuring out novel ways of working together and collaborating, even in 88, 89 was this at this point?
Yeah, this would have been late 88. So they actually, the script comes together way faster than they were expecting to. They bring it back to the network, and the network says, "We love this, but we have no idea where this is going to be able to go. So you guys tell us what's going to happen if it turns into a full season." So they actually put all the details, well, I mean, roughly, of what would probably happen in season one, except they put it in the shape of a Twin Peaks Gazette. So they actually hand ABC this little newspaper that has like all the plot details that they want. And that pretty much sealed the deal. It's like I don't think ABC thought that it would go anywhere either, but they thought it was interesting enough. It's like, let's just gamble on it. I mean, what's the worst that could happen? We get something else that's really interesting. Ooh.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they go into the casting phase, and it's all about having conversations with the actors as they come in. It's not about line reading, and it's like I just figured it was eccentric and everything, but I can't remember who said it, but it sounds actually way more practical than just getting the vibe of somebody. It's like they wanted to find people that they were not going to have personality conflicts with. They wanted to find people that kind of embodied a certain energy for the roles, but they also wanted to just be able to know that they're going to be able to work with everybody.
Yeah, and it seems to be the way Lynch casts everything. He goes on usually a single picture and then just how he feels when he's having a cup of coffee with them, which I think, I mean, it sounds very sort of woo-woo, but I think it's actually very sensible, like you say. Am I going to get on with these people?
Yeah.
But the wonderful Joanna Ray was leading the casting, wasn't she?
Yes. Yeah, she brought all the people to him, and like famously kept giving him James Marshall, and even though his photo looked like it was from Teen Beat. Yeah.
Oh, poor James.
Oh, I know.
He'll always be cool.
Well, yeah, and David Lynch eventually figured it out too.
Some people never figured it out.
Yeah.
But James.
Yeah.
So tell us about do you know how they cast Laura, the role of Laura? Because Cheryl Lee was a complete unknown. I think she'd just done some amateur dramatics at home.
Yeah, well, she and Phoebe Augustin were basically just extras, and they wanted to figure out like which was going to be the girl and which was going to be the one on the bridge, and I think I can't remember if it was Phoebe or Cheryl who said it, but like they basically come up to a question of like, are you comfortable with nudity? And Phoebe basically says, I'm not so sure. And Cheryl says, no problem. And that's how they got which role they got.
And it couldn't have hurt that she was blonde, which kind of plays into this iconic, archetypal blonde woman with a tragic situation, echoing a little bit of the Goddess script that never came to pass.
Yeah.
And Shelley and Audrey, do you know about how they were cast?
Yeah, well, Shelley and Audrey were basically characters that like didn't exactly exist. Like Frost had an idea about Audrey, but like he was figuring it would be like this small little role, and he basically everybody saw Cheryl and Fenn, and they're like, "Oh, okay, we can we can run with this all the way to the moon."
Yeah, very wise.
Yeah, and then Mensch and Emma came in.
Probably likewise with Shelley.
Yeah, I'm pretty confident of that because she came in to read for Donna's part, and like she gets like maybe a line into. I guess they did a little bit of reading. Just to kind of get an idea of like what kind of part they're looking at, and then he comes up, like he just interrupts and says, "No, Shelley," and then like totally explodes this like background character. Like they came up with like Shelley the waitress, and she was going to be like Toad the guy who like eats the food at the tables or something.
Yeah, and just a background.
Yeah, but imagine Hammock, she becomes a main character. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Again, you'd be mad not to
Mhm.
have as much of her on screen as you possibly could.
Yeah.
And then obviously you've got the actors that Lynch was already, he famously loves to work with the same people again and again. So Kyle MacLachlan obviously was in
Yeah.
Blue Velvet, and this is a sort of almost a continuation of that character in some ways, of this like apple pie, gee whiz kind of energy.
Yeah.
But also Joan Chen was brought in last minute, I believe.
Yeah. That nobody that I can find data on. Like everybody's like, we don't know how Joan Chen really got involved in this. Like I think they obviously saw her work, and oh my gosh, The Last Emperor. I can't remember which one like really hit big over in America, but like she was a known actress at the time, but like how she like specifically got involved in Twin Peaks is like almost a mystery. But it was in Fast Action. I mean, it was quick after Isabella Rossellini withdrew from the project because she had another movie that needed to be filmed right around then, and like nobody, this is like practically a vanity project according to everybody. It was never going to see the light of day, so like why not just pick the movie? Yeah.
Hence we're working with largely
Yeah.
unknowns or new actors, generally speaking.
Yeah.
But sad again that Rossellini wasn't able to be part of the Twin Peaks universe.
I know. She was going to be the love interest for Cooper, if you can believe it.
Oh, I can believe it, and I would buy a ticket for that.
Yeah, I think about the only remnant we're getting on that is when Cooper says, "Who's the babe?" in this episode. Other than that, like they completely dropped the romance, which I mean, I honestly think that was probably one of the best parts about this accident is that we can have our Cooper Harry I'm not romance bromance.
I mean, you never know. Maybe in another reboot.
Yeah. Yeah, a reboot called Green Butt Skunk.
But I guess in the good way, it paved the way for the echo of Kyle MacLachlan and Laura Dern having this romance in season 3.
Yeah.
Which a lot of fans weren't that too happy with, but if you look at it with, in terms of like how season 3 plays with a lot of Lynchian canon, I guess it's good that Agent Cooper never really found his love. But I still do wonder, where's Annie?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting how Lynch just decides like what parts he wants to bring into X or Y, and yeah, it's I don't know. We'll have a lot to say about all of that as we get a little closer to season 3.
So let's look at location and filming.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, that was also kind of a happy accident because they were going through multiple days of scouting locations, and like they kept looking and couldn't find anything, and like it's the last day they're in the Snoqualmie and North Bend area, and like they're just driving around. And it's like, oh, there's the mill. Oh, there's the hotel. There's this. It's like everything was just like popping up, and it's almost like here we are, just revealing themselves.
And that hotel on the waterfall, I mean, really stunning.
Yeah, exactly.
The mountains behind the diner, it's all there. Beautiful.
Yeah, and the whole thing just sounds like magic. Like they filmed in early '89, so like this actually came together pretty quickly. So like in early '89, I wouldn't be surprised if it was February 24th when they actually started. But my my research could only pinpoint so far. But yeah, early 1989, like everybody like who was part of it, the crew, the cast, like anybody just thought that it was like this amazing, like almost family level experience. And they shot for 6 weeks and even got snowed in. So like you would think that like if it wasn't a great experience. Like all everybody would remember is like, oh, we couldn't even go into town. We got snowed in on this stupid project or whatever.
Yeah.
But like nobody was like that. Like it's because Lynch and Frost decided to secure their own funding for it. Like instead of going with a regular studio, because they wanted
Mm-hmm.
stuff like Final Cut. They wanted to be able to just, do whatever they wanted and have the control over it that you can't
Right.
get in Hollywood. So
Yeah.
they went
Lynch was not
outside
going
of
to hand
Hollywood.
that over after Dune. So.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, so they had to go to an international company to get the funding. But they really did just start doing things the way they wanted to. And the way they
So was the
started
pilot? Sorry.
No, that's okay.
I was just going to say, so was the pilot exclusively filmed in Snoqualmie? There was nothing filmed in
Yes.
studios as well? It was
That's
all there?
true.
Wow.
Yep,
Wow.
all over 6 weeks. And they started it out with this big giant feast for everybody. And it's like they wanted to have like a communal meal where everybody was there. I mean, that is cast and crew and like, anybody involved, publicity, I'm sure. It's like everybody just got to hang out together, got to know each other as people, and then they started working.
I would have loved to be a fly on the wall for those few weeks, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And about the shooting itself, like I'm not going to go into a whole bunch because I mean we've already been talking about it for a while. But Sherilyn Fenn had a great quote in Reflections. She basically says, David is not weird in the way everyone wants to say he is. He's eccentric, kind, and he never yells on set. It's always relaxed and it's very, very abstract. He's not there to tell everyone what to do. He describes it like there's a soundboard in front of him, and he turns up the volume, turns something else down, and then adds a little more bass. He hires the people he knows are essentially right for the role and makes little adjustments. And then Peggy Lipton, in a book that was published in actually December of '90, Twin Peaks Behind the Scenes by Mark Altman, she says, when you're around David Lynch, it's like every nerve cell in your body tunes up your craft. So like there's all this frequency talk already, and like I'm not even in my theories.
Yes, indeed. The themes were there. It just seems like one of those, moments in time where everything just aligns perfectly and the right people come to the project and it all. Yeah, I know it wasn't all smooth sailing the whole way through, but certainly sounds like it got off to a pretty magical start, which set the tone for the cast.
Yeah, and the only thing they had to do to get all that is to have this contractually obligated material at the end. Because, they, basically, if the pilot wasn't going to get picked up by ABC, it was going to be turned into a movie over for the international markets. And it's basically... David Lynch put it, who knows if it's actually true or not, but he says he put his hand on a hot car, and it all came to him in a flash about the Red Room and everything. So what ended up being the last 25 minutes of this material that we'll never see is, instead of seeing the gloved hand taking the necklace from the ground that Sarah Palmer sees, she actually sees a vision of Bob at the end of Laura's bed, which eventually leads into Philip Gerard calling the police to the hospital, where there's a showdown with a very killable Bob in the basement. So, and then it's followed by the Red Room scene that takes place literally 25 years later. So, it's all pretty much there, and it's going to get repurposed into episode 2, but we're not going to talk about that now because, it fits in better there. But I mean,
absolutely.
Like Frost said.
But it's great that the seeds were there.
Yeah.
Because of what they had to do contractually, actually.
Yeah, and like Frost said, just because it was contractually obligated doesn't mean it wasn't cool, and they were for sure going to actually find a way to include that.
So the end result?
Yeah, that pretty much sums up everything as far as like the filming itself. And, they go through a marketing campaign to make sure that it gets shown enough places that ABC almost has to air it, and they decide to. So the end result is April 8th, 1990, airing immediately following America's Funniest Home Videos, which was in its first season.
Oh my
So, it's like, 20 minutes before Twin Peaks starts, you got Bob Saget, like, saying,
Watching
pushing a
people
rock,
slip
pushing
up
a
on.
rock, pushing a
Yeah.
rock, pushing a rock, while the dog's, like, literally pushing a rock. So, it's like, I can't even imagine what the tone shift was, because I didn't watch
Yeah.
it. And really,
Kind
the only person in my house who did watch it was my mom. She had to go upstairs because I think my dad. Well, we only had cable on one TV because that's how it worked back then, and I'm pretty sure that's how he saw the White Sox beat up on the Brewers. But yeah,
Wow.
so my mom was watching it and eventually recorded it over the summer, so that's how I got into it. But she was hooked all the way, and she actually watched all 30 episodes when they aired, which is awesome.
What a
And
cool mom.
yeah,
I
oh, I
think
know.
a few years later, after 1990, it found its way to South Africa, and my mom was a Hill Street Blues fan,
Oh.
so she watched a bit of it, but it really freaked her out. Really freaked her out. So she always told me that, like, there's something not right about that show.
I mean, she's not wrong.
I mean, Catholic school will put the fear into you.
Yeah.
So but I always found it interesting that she'd always said, just that particular show, there's something not right about it.
Yeah.
Okay, Mom.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm going to watch it when I'm able to get my hands on it.
Yeah, it's like noted.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that was later when I found my way to it.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank goodness it all came to be.
Absolutely. And I know my mom wasn't the only one watching it, because it turned out that it was a certified rating smash, and it had, at the end of the year, it was the highest ratings for any 2-hour movie for the whole year. So it did well.
Were they running the Who Killed Laura Palmer campaign before the pilot?
Yeah, it was like there was a little bit of I don't know if they actually said Who Killed Laura Palmer then, but they, like, the campaign that I remember seeing a lot of commercials for is like, it's a nice town, but you wouldn't want to die there, or something like that. So it was like really playing up the whole noir of it.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, well, that's pretty much how it got made and why it got made. And we're going to obviously talk about, like, what we think about the product itself. But before we do that, we want to get into the David Lynch's final statement on the pilot, just for his own particular recontextualization, because he wrote the Log Lady intros that would air in 1993, because it was this nice little extra that they were doing when it got syndicated to the Bravo network, which was a cable station. So yeah, like back then, everybody thought that Twin Peaks was just dead as a doornail, and we would never see it again. This was kind of it. So Lynch's words here with the Log Lady intros, I mean, that's as good a point of view as you were ever going to get from Lynch, as far as like what he thought about the episodes, and or what he wanted us to think about as we watch the episodes.
So, yes, over to one of my favourite characters of all time within Twin Peaks, the wise Oracle, aka the Log Lady. And the Log Lady intro for the pilot, which I'm going to grab my log for, is as follows. Welcome to Twin Peaks. My name is Margaret Lantman. I live in Twin Peaks. I am known as the Log Lady. There is a story behind that. There are many stories in Twin Peaks. Some of them are sad, some funny. Some of them are stories of madness, of violence. Some are ordinary. Yet they all have about them a sense of mystery. The mystery of life. Sometimes the mystery of death. The mystery of the woods surrounding Twin Peaks. To introduce this story, let me just say it encompasses the all. It is beyond the fire, though few would know what that means. It is a story of many, but begins with one, and I knew her. The one leading to the many is Laura Palmer. Laura is the one. So instead of being fridged and forgotten, as we move on to try and understand the town and its weirdness, Lynch remembers Laura.
Mm-hmm.
Unlike Frost, Peyton, and Engels, who broke down stories and character development in a TV-compatible way, Lynch dove in with respect to the character and took that compassion to heart. I think I see Twin Peaks as a very seismic turning point in Lynch as a artist and a director.
Mm-hmm.
I would argue his feminist-leaning interest in women as their own, as the focus of a piece, and also of trauma at the hands of misogyny, I think took root with Laura.
Mm-hmm.
And he really fell in love with this character to the point where he couldn't let go of her when everyone else was ready to. He wanted her to live, and that's how the direction of Fire Walk With Me was born. When he went back in one more time, he went backwards rather than forwards, something that we might see again in The Return.
Yeah, I kind of wonder. I don't. This isn't founded in anything other than like I almost wonder if like Lynch recognizes this need in him to like go back and like make Laura Palmer alive for us in that movie. Like if it's at all like that instinct, like if he could have done it in the show, like within that reality, like would he have done it? And like it almost makes me feel like that was like the beginning instinct for like, you know, what Cooper did in the end of part 17, where he actually goes into Fire Walk With Me and you know, rescues her or whatever. You know, like
Absolutely.
whatever Cooper thinks he's doing, you know, whether it's like really happening or not, you know, it's like it's still true for Cooper. And it just
Yes.
makes me wonder if like this instinct to give Laura Palmer life like feeds into that eventually.
Absolutely. Yeah. It seems to be a very meta reference to his own sense of wanting to not necessarily white knight her back into existence, but wanting to turn the clock back and wanting to put the focus on the victim, I think, in a way that actually really had not been done before, and until this day still isn't done enough, where we focus on you know, a beautiful young victim, but we focus more on the perpetrator or sort of more sensational aspects of the victim's life rather than who they really were. And I think it's rightly so. I think Lynch's instincts to try and have Cheryl Lee in the show as much as possible was very smart. She's I wish she'd been more active and more utilized as an actress post her work on Fire Walk With Me, because it's absolutely incredible, and her work in the show is incredible as well.
Absolutely.
But yes, I think definitely season 3 we see Lynch regretting that he can't go back in time and just make her live. And I hope, and time will only tell, that maybe Carrie Page is the key to continue. But yes, he sees her still with us when he sees Cheryl Lee. Obviously, he kind of like the project that never came to pass kind of plants her consciousness in her cousin Maddie, just as a way of bringing her back. And also, of course, the Red Room where we see her. Yeah, I think Lynch's love for the character of Laura Palmer was also something that gave him great sadness, because he saw her as the Pandora's box of mystery that everything would stem from. As the Log Lady says, she is the one. But also she's such an interesting character because she's just a complete contradiction innately.
Mm-hmm.
She has an innate duality. And so instead of just being the cause of investigation, she is a person.
Mm-hmm.
And long before she was dead, she lives. Mm-hmm. So this is something that we'll see throughout the whole of Twin Peaks, including Fire Walk with Me.
Yes.
But I think as a woman, I really appreciate that she wasn't just a femme fatale or an angel. You know, she was a transcendent, flawed human being of dark and light.
Mm-hmm.
And I really appreciate that we got to see more of her in Fire Walk with Me.
Yeah. Yeah, me too. Yeah, as a storyteller, like, you can go back. I'm not trying to say like that. I mean, I'm not saying that you're saying that I'm saying it, but just, covering my bases, that, like, the actual ability as a storyteller to go back and tell older stories or previous stories, like, that's totally within reason, because, I mean, it's fiction at the end of the day. So,
and I think
actually
that's what's
is respectful to go back for Lynch to do it.
Yeah. And it I think that is part of the magic of Lynch, is he has the audacity to not want to stick to the rules of of fiction, but also just the rules of reality. He's like, no. It's not as simple as just there is one truth and there is one even dimension, and I think all credit to Frost for his Jungian approach and his interest in the esoteric and his interest in also in social justice, which I think can come out in a sense of for all of the darkness in Twin Peaks, there is a sense of light and of people trying to do the right thing despite all of that. So the story encompasses the all. So yes, for Frost, he saw it as a collective unconscious, but for Lynch, he calls this thing the unified field. And this is, again, something that's going to come up again and again throughout all of the text.
Yeah. Yeah, and like when you see Lynch use words like the story encompasses the all, again, like there's these little symbols that, like, he puts into everything, and it'll come out in these Log Lady intros, like what like what we're gonna do is kind of it's not exactly break the code, solve the crime, but I think we will try to, like, associate things, like, as far as like how they've been used in the future, in the past, like, just in general.
Yeah. It's almost like the Log Lady is a direct mouthpiece of their thoughts on the text in a way. She's able to bridge the gap between the real world and the world of Twin Peaks, and almost directly tell us, what we're seeing, and the codes that will come up again, the symbols that will come up again and again, including fire. She says, "Beyond the fire, though few would know that meaning." So what's the fire?
Well, depending on when else she talks about it, there's this kind of fire is hard to put out. And like, it seems like fire can be good and it can be bad. And remember,
as Deputy Hawk says, it depends on your intention on how you use it.
Yep, in part 11, when he and Frank Truman are looking at the living map, there's fire, and then there's also a symbol for black fire. And about the fire, Hawk will say, the symbol's a type of fire, more like modern day electricity. And then Frank says, good. Hawk says, it depends. It depends on the intention behind the fire. So, like, to me, like, the fire is basically like what electricity does, which is it runs things. It's like it's the flow of the energy, or it's the energy that can flow.
Our world, in a way, yeah.
Yeah.
And but the tools.
Yeah, but then when Margaret says here, beyond the fire, so it's beyond the energy itself, and I kind of associate it with, like, what's beyond it is how you use it. And
Mm-hmm.
that really plays into so many things about Twin Peaks. Like, there's the darkness
Absolutely.
and the light. And
Yeah,
the story
absolutely.
seems like it's a big fight between the Black Lodge and the White Lodge by the end of it. And, it's like, it doesn't matter how,
Mm,
like, plot specific or how
mm,
metaphorical it all is. It just always, I think it really is about, how the electricity flows through real people and the
mm.
metaphysical.
Yes, yes. And definitely something I think that comes up in season 3 in part 8 when we see the
Hmm.
ultimate form of dark usage of fire
Yep.
in a atomic bomb.
Yeah.
Um, yes, and also obviously we get the kind of literal fire at
Hmm.
the end of season 1. Sorry, end of season 2, which they were hoping was gonna give, there'd be enough cliffhangers
Hmm.
that they would get a third season.
Yeah, they were
Unfortunately, there
trying
wasn't to
that
be, but
that throw in the kitchen sink again.
yeah, but it kind of makes sense. If you've got a sawmill, you've got the woods,
Hmm.
you've got Margaret Landman talking about fire. Sort of fits, doesn't it, that a
Hmm.
fire would happen at some point, some destruction
Yeah.
of the natural order of things. Yeah, so the story is beyond these things. The force for doing these things, the flow of energy, as you said, is just the flow of energy, and it's the intention behind it. But she also says Laura is the one, which we have
Hmm.
picked up before. So, as we said, all stories come from her. She is our entry point. She is the spark.
Hmm.
Um, and mirrored in part 10, when Log Lady calls Hawk, some of the most heartbreaking and beautiful scenes I think I've ever seen are
Yeah.
the telephone calls that she has between her dying days and Deputy Hawk. Um,
Yeah. So in part 10, this is what she says to Hawk at the end of the episode, right before Rebecca
mm-hmm,
Del Rio sings No Stars. She
mm,
says, Hawk, electricity is humming. You hear it in the mountains and the rivers. You see it dance among the seas and stars and glowing around the moon. But in
mm,
these days the glow is dying. What will be in the darkness that remains? The Truman brothers are both true men. They are your brothers. And the others, the good ones who have been with you. Now the circle is almost complete. Watch and listen to the dream of a time and space. It all comes out now, flowing like a river. That which is and is not. Hawk, Laura is the one. Yeah, so um, Pamela Terazak over at the Twin Peaks Between Two Worlds Facebook group, she made a
mm-hmm,
point, oh man, a couple of years ago at this point probably, where that which is and is not comes right before Laura is the one. So
mm,
like in this pilot, the way it's used is like she's the beginning of everything. She's where she's the kind of like the explosion where all the stories come from almost.
mm,
But in
mm-hmm,
this case, it's almost like a signifier of there is and Laura is, where it's almost implying that the one that is not could be like Carrie Page or Lodge
mm,
Laura. Um,
mm-hmm.
and I just like that really linked up with what I was thinking at the time. And I kind of feel almost like there's a reality as well that is and is not, and that Laura
Mm,
signifies the one that is.
mm-hmm.
And yeah,
Mm.
I just find it interesting. Like anytime Lynch says Laura is the one, it's like, is she like, you could almost say that like that golden orb in part 8 actually is the birth of Laura. But like we obviously have a lot to unpack with that, but like this is going to be one
Yes,
of those
ongoing.
yeah, like this is definitely going to be a preoccupation like between
As we go forward.
between the two of us looking forward like with every episode.
So having said that, let's move on to specific scenes that we want to highlight that will have more tendrils of stories to come out of it.
What's up, gang? This is Hoptimus. You've been listening to one of the great new podcasts from Ruminations Radio Network. If you want some more tasty sound vibes, come check out my new podcast, The Retro Futurist Culture, where we talk about alternate timelines, cyberpunk, anime, and other crazy worlds. If that does not strike your fancy, we have plenty of other great shows at ruminationsradionetwork.com.
So we've looked at the importance of Laura, and we've looked at how David Lynch tends to think of her, but we haven't really looked at what kind of presence we actually see Laura as in the original series. And now that we're entering our scene analysis, it seems like a good place to start, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So yes, Laura is our protagonist, but an interesting kind of protagonist, and one that I think's been echoed throughout a lot of television, to the point of potentially becoming a bit of a problematic trope of the beautiful, blonde, usually successful or high profile but troubled female who is fridged from the start and is a murder that needs solving. So there is that element. When we see the pilot, we see, firstly, when we see her body iconically wrapped in plastic, almost like a Barbie doll that's in packaging that's being unveiled. But also, as some have pointed out online, her face is blue and the plastic is like petals framing her face. We also see her photograph. Again, iconically, the one that's used, her homecoming queen photograph that's used in the end credits. And we hear her name mentioned, obviously. Sarah calling out her name, which is echoed again throughout the series, and we'll hear that, obviously, in the return in some kind of time warp. We also see her absence as almost a presence. So we see eerily empty spaces that follow in her wake and follow conversations about her. The suddenly deathly silent sawmill when Josie decides to shut it. The desolate roads of like a February in the Northwest Pacific. The single point perspective hallways of the school and the morgue. And we also see her presence and absence in her relationships with those in Twin Peaks who knew her, loved her, had trouble with her, had, various different types of relationships with her, and then learn of her death and mourn her. Is there anything you want to add on that point, John?
Well, it's impossible to not remember what the Diane podcast talks about it if you've listened to their show at all. It's a regular kind of theme over there. And I mean it's so obvious once you hear it, but they like to call it an absent presence that Laura is. Like Rosie, she'll say she's an absent character who is not absence and will fight her way to presence. And they'll say like how she's revealed in every photo, every videotape, audio tape, conversation with Jacoby, like everything. And it's like she's revealing herself as a presence. And Mark, their host, he basically said, when the investigation is over, Laura will finally be given her life back, but also her death. And I think that's pretty... It's pretty telling about just why we as a culture back in 1990 just got obsessed with like who this person is, because back in the day a typical case would be solved in a single episode. You'd see the case of the week at the very beginning, and then the protagonist would show up like immediately and solve it. But like straight from the get-go, it's it's like a full half an hour before Dale Cooper even arrives. So like we're this presence of Laura really is just like it's kind of embodying and haunting the show almost like a ghost.
Absolutely. It also then plays in as the sort of mythology starts building of a kind of duality of she lives and yet she's dead.
Yeah.
She is Laura, but she isn't Laura. Is she actually Maddie? Is she Carrie? Is she none of these people? Is she just a symbol? Is she just a hollow figure? Is she everything? So it's kind of there from the start with, like you say, this stretched out period of time that we see Twin Peaks, and we see this absence playing out with such a presence. And yes, and definitely there are problems, I think, obviously, when we look back at it from a 2021 perspective. But I do think as the series plays out, some of those problems are, if not directly addressed, they are developed, and there's more nuance added as we go along.
Yeah.
And I'm just so glad that Lynch and Frost recognised Cheryl Lee's talent, because I'm so astounded at her talent, and I wish she'd had more work as an actress, because it's really just stunning stuff, and she is the perfect Laura. She really is.
Oh, absolutely.
So we also see her presence and absence in the community of Twin Peaks, who don't need to be told that she's died. They sort of sense it in some way. And this is from even like the first scene with Josie, where she's putting on her makeup in this kind of reverie of Million Miles Away mind and singing this tune, where it almost seems to be that she's knowing something before she knows it. And she's sensing something that she doesn't quite know. Obviously this is like most overtly shown with Sarah, who's shown to have this kind of psychic ability in some way, and her level of anxiety when she casually goes to check on Laura, but you can see pretty quite obviously that she knows something's up, and before even the words have come out on the phone that Laura's been found dead, she's breaking down in tears. Who else doesn't need to be told about Laura's death?
Yeah, well, the first person who actually sees Laura and doesn't really use her name is Pete, and that's kind of an interesting choice, because like he doesn't actually know it's Laura, but like she's dead, like stuff like that. Like he it's like his nomenclature sticks even after the fact, but it's kind of, I don't know, it's interesting that they picked Pete to do it too, because Jack Nance was in Eraserhead. I mean, he's a friend of Lynch since forever, and he was in every single Lynch production he was able to be in up until his death in the late 90s. And he kind of that way that he and Lynch like didn't have to talk, like they just kind of knew how to be on the same wavelength. It's like he started out presenting with that. Yeah, and I think Pete's friendship with Josie and Audrey, it kind of fits almost that maybe he had that kind of friendship with Laura as well, that she was someone that he was in some way close to, but we never get shown this. But this sense of like the sort of supernatural bubbling under the surface, I mean, it's so well done, because you don't see any Red Room, you don't see any lodge spirits, you don't see anything in that pilot. There's just this ominous sense of something being just ever so slightly uncanny. And that obviously will just continue to play out and play out and play out and echo out. And then, yes, so there's an echo of when the giant announces
Maddie's death without actually announcing it. In the devastating episode when we see Maddie's death and we see everyone in the roadhouse in tears and crying and knowing somehow that this awful thing has happened again.
Yeah.
Why, but back to Pete. So why do you think Pete was the one chosen to find Laura? Is it just because of this, like, relationship with Lynch, or?
I would think so, more than anything, because, like, the inflection that he puts into the words and, like, the understanding of, like, what kind of gravity this needs to be. Like, he puts it out there immediately with, I mean, you know, everybody, it's iconic, you know, she's dead, wrapped in plastic, you know, like, he just, he gets...
The delivery is great.
Yeah, he gets the idea of, like, how to present it to be, like, weirdly mysterious and strange and haunting.
And yet kind of comforting and homely because it's wrapped in this sweet man who's just going fishing. Yeah, absolutely. Pete and fish, there's something in that. Hey, he always catches the big fish. We also have the first time that we see the screaming courtyard girl, which we obviously then see again in the return, which is, I think, one of the most effective parts of the pilot because it just makes sense. Like, you could logically explain. Maybe she found out before everyone else in the school found out. It hasn't been announced, so that's a bit problematic, but maybe she did. There's possibly she did.
Yeah, the school secretary told the principal, it's like, there's rumors all over the school. So, I mean, I'm assuming that the courtyard girl kind of caught wind of that.
But then at the same time, the timing of seeing her just before Donna seems to realize as well is... and also, you know, someone doesn't usually, like, scream out into the yard like that.
Yeah.
You know, not quite. It's not the normal way people in the Western world respond to the news of terrible news. So there is something that's just ever so slightly, again, just enough to be unsettling to a viewer that's seeing it for the first time.
Yeah, and Lynch has a thing with screams anyway. It hasn't become a code here. It's more of like a punctuation of, like, you know, it's like the second that the police officer is telling the teacher what the problem is, probably that Laura had died, that's when we get the explosion of a scream. And there's this code that, it's especially in season 3, it's, like, obvious. I mean, the fact that he brings the courtyard girl back in the very first opening sequence,
it starts with the scream and ends with the scream, the return.
Well, yeah, that's true. But it seems like everything, like Janie E's screaming when Dougie puts the fork in the socket, Lucy screaming when Frank Truman shows up. You know, it's like it's all over the return. That it's the person who screams, there's something wrong, but they don't quite understand. Or if it's like the screaming Laura in the Red Room, it's like there's something wrong, and she's making sure that Dale Cooper knows that he doesn't understand. And I think in this case, the scream happened because, like, we as an audience almost didn't understand, or we did, and, like, we're seeing, like, all these people that know something's wrong, and they're not quite there yet.
Yeah.
But that's what unlocks Donna.
Yeah. So, yeah, Donna is a big one in terms of, like, you can just see that she's realised when she looks into Laura's absence in school and the empty chair, she knows. Which, again, we will see more of their relationship and how Donna might have intuited that something terrible would have happened to Laura when we see Fire Walk With Me.
Yeah.
And James as well seems to also just know something's not right.
Yeah.
Again, something we'll see more developed in Fire Walk With Me. But an interesting one is Audrey, when she's told, doesn't really have much of an emotional reaction.
Yeah, it's almost like, you know, like she's got the gears going on in her head, and she's like, well, that tracks.
Yeah. Or she's just a little bit of a psychopath.
Yeah, well, in the pilot, that's definitely
possible.
kind of what they were shooting for, I think.
Yeah. And obviously Audrey's character is a very strange one in the way it's developed, let's say. Even though I have a soft spot for her.
Yeah.
Bobby needs to be told quite firmly. In fact, he's in denial about it.
Yeah.
Which probably tracks in terms of he's not really that plugged into Laura. He's not really that interested in Laura at that point. He's, chasing Shelley in the diner.
Yeah.
But yes, definitely the strongest reaction we see is from the incredible performance by Grace Zabriskie, who I just... Woo! I love that woman.
Absolutely.
And I'm so glad that she worked again with Lynch in Wild at Heart and Inland Empire. But we see her reaction in the Palmer House, which the Palmer House becomes almost like a lodge space within the town. It's such a kind of portal of darkness that we see, and with that weirdly unnerving shot that we see of her going upstairs with the ceiling fan, and we see the ceiling fan turning. And credit to Lynch, I think, in understanding trauma and how someone might focus on something so small in a room when being assaulted, and that might be almost the thing that they remember more than the assault, this kind of disassociation of why we're focusing on the ceiling fan, which we see again and again, and this sort of this maybe symbol of like this turning, recurring, terrible cycle, if you wanted to get really deep on it. But what is going on in the Palmer House? This is the question, and we're introduced to the Palmer House with this ominous feeling from the get-go. And as the pilot goes on, we see this with when Sarah is talking to Harry and Hawk and Agent Cooper, and she gets very disturbed. She hears footsteps upstairs, and she says, "Who's upstairs?" as though she is sensing that the perpetrator is there. And obviously the reply is this wonderful little seed that's planted, whereas, oh, it's just Leland, it's just your husband. So again, this psychicness, this ability for her to sort of know things on some level is introduced. Which we then, potentially, we don't get this confirmed in season 3, but the young girl in episode 8 certainly seems to fit quite well, that there's some sort of darkness that's also entered Sarah, but it's somehow also connecting her in a psychic way. She seems to understand. So if we compare and contrast with part 12, the scene between Hawk and Sarah, there are some interesting ways.
It's strange because it's like almost exactly reversed, because here she'll say, "Who's upstairs?" And Harry says, "Your husband's upstairs with one of my men," and it's Hawk. And in part 12 we see this reflection of it, where angry Sarah has something going on in the kitchen, and Hawk asks her in like multiple ways, basically like, "Do you need help? Will you accept my help?" And she just says it's a goddamn bad story, and like she basically refuses to give him that simple information, like, "Who's upstairs? It's you with my husband." It's like she shuts it down, whereas in this case, like, she wants to kind of be there, but then they're giving her this drug. It's like in part 12 she's doing the Bloody Marys and everything, but like, we see the shot in the arm of like whatever morphine or whatever it is that is supposed to calm her down medically.
And obviously her drinking Bloody Marys also plays into something that we can talk about later on, of the mother figure inverted in a sort of unholy way.
But like whether she's super angry at Hawk, or whether she's here like experiencing grief for the first major wave, she has to be kind of drowned in something to, something to cloud what she's actually experiencing.
Yeah, there's the substance abuse issue all the way through, and it's always in a sort of socially acceptable way. Laura was dealing with her trauma via substances that were, it's not acceptable. But Sarah's substance abuse is always in a way that's kind of normalized. So it's, it's the kind town doctor giving her some God knows what, or it's Bloody Marys that you can get bought in a shop. So definitely an interesting one with Sarah, who becomes probably one of the most important characters we see returning in season 3. And along with this sense of the supernatural, the psychic that we're seeing through Sarah, do you think there are signs in this early stage in the pilot of other timelines and frequencies?
I would say so. And we have to look into this because of the way season 3 ended, and the way Final Dossier kind of has this alternate history. You have to consider from the very beginning, like, are there seeds that, and obviously at the time, multiple timelines was not intended at all. But, Lynch and Frost, when creating season 3, they sort of, like, it's not retconning per se, but they leave all these dangling threads to be picked up later in some way or another. It's kind of like how Judy was in Fire Walk With Me originally most likely to become Josie's sister. But obviously that didn't happen in the final official stuff. And, that's kind of what I'm looking at here when I'm looking for other timelines and frequencies, is basically like, there's this weirdness in Twin Peaks, but is it coded to be like lodge space creeping in officially? In, is this an element that they eventually use to show things like multiple timelines or whatever you want to say was happening in season 3? And I think you can actually see things, because there's a very noticeable level of like magical realism in the original Twin Peaks. And I think you could attribute that magical realism into evolving into the idea of the multiple timelines or frequencies. And I think you just see it. You just see it all over the place, like with drug use in general. And I'm crediting oh my gosh, I'm crediting Sarah's shot in the arm as a drug use, because what that's doing is it's kind of masking over what she's actually experiencing in the real world. So she's like having this filtered delusion essentially imposed on her. And you can see that with all sorts of things. Yep. Even oh my gosh, like in the Fire Walk With Me scene where they're talking about the muffin, the great wench, the homecoming queen even kind of becomes a nickname. There's ways of kind of like talking about alternate views that are sort of on a negative frequency. And that's how I tend to see it. I don't see multiple timelines per se, but I see like there's a positive frequency and there's a negative frequency. And then there's the physical reality that it kind of all imposes on. And like we sort of get to see it here and there. And, in this case, we see Bobby and Mike going over to the Hayward's house to get Donna. And, they've been drinking, which we've already talked about, kind of fits into this. And, we see Bobby on the hood of a car surfing. Obviously he's in a little bit of a different frequency from regular life. We see it a lot with him in particular, and Mike, really, with the barking in the jail cell.
Toxic masculinity, if ever I've seen it.
Yeah, but there's that weird sound design
Yeah.
to it too, like where there's like multiple bobbies going raw, you know. It like they fade in and they come over, and yeah.
And this close up of the mouth that Lynch does, you know, he employs that over and over again as this like primal sort of dark side of a human's reaction, negative side, let's say. Yeah, that is an interesting one. And if it wasn't for Bobby's beautiful curtains, I just don't know. He gets away with so much with that incredible haircut. Ahead of his time.
Absolutely.
Trailblazer. So obviously in the title Twin Peaks, we have this idea that's been put into the actual fabric of the show from the very get-go of duality, twins, shadows, echoes, and mirrors. And the first scene we see is of a lady looking into the mirror, which is Josie, observing her reflection. And obviously the mirror is a very interesting symbol, a Jungian symbol, or archetype, or just a symbolism that's been used in art many times in terms of consciousness, and also looking at one's shadow and reflecting on maybe the things we don't want to see or the things we do want to see. But also Alice in Wonderland, through the looking glass, it introduces an idea of another world, a mirror reflection, parallel universe, a place that we can't quite get to, but we can potentially sense or see. Josie's in a bit of a dreamlike state in that first scene. It took me a while to kind of analyze the first scene because it's not an obvious choice in some ways. Josie's maybe not a character that you'd think of as like the first character we see for Twin Peaks. I think possibly, to be fair, they probably picked her because that face is just so beautiful that of course you would want to see that face as the first thing you see. But she's painting on makeup, almost like painting a mask onto her face.
Absolutely.
But it's an interesting one, again, from a 2021 perspective, to see her as the first thing. If we're looking at it from in terms of the male gaze in cinema and TV and the female gaze. And unfortunately, with the character of Josie, we see her really throughout the season, just from a male gaze perspective, as a beautiful, exotic, and I put that in quotes, lady who has a troubled past and, troubled and needs a savior in the form of Harry. But at the very least, in this first scene, we see her viewing herself and her gazing.
And choosing to hide herself too, in a way. Like she's painting her eyebrows, basically. Like, it's like she's painting the face she wants to see over the face that she sees.
Yes, so there's a sense of someone concealing who they are, which is something that comes up in this character. But I think an unintended part of Twin Peaks, unfortunately, is a dualism, even in the feminist side of it, which you can read, and also the misogynist side, which you can clearly see as well. And there is these kind of like competing elements to the season, which I think I fall much more kindly in the way I view it, because I do think that we need to see art in terms of when it was made. And I think if you actually see this piece compared to everything else that was being made, there's just no comparison. It was so ahead of its time. And yes, the cast is not as diverse as we would want to see, especially in season 3. I think there's a lot more critique that we could go into there, which I think is fair. But I think if we're looking at the 1990, this was made in 89, in fact, it's actually a pretty diverse cast, and also the focus on women's abuse, I think, that had never been seen on TV, not really ever seen properly, I think, in a way that looked at the woman's perspective of yes, abuse of women and female trauma. But talking of female trauma, we have Sarah in the final scene, and back to her psychicness and her ability to see things that maybe people can't see. Sarah is often seen underneath a mirror, with a mirror behind her, which is an interesting thing because as much as she's a character that can see, it's usually behind her. We see that again in season 3, that she sits with the mirror behind her. So it's the ability to see that she has, but the decision and choices she's made not to see certain things, and turning away and dissociating from actually the things that she knows are going on potentially. Yes, and that's definitely a theme in the Palmer house in general.
Yeah, and it almost like you saying like the mirrors are like just showing something that she can't see or something. It's almost, it reminds me of in that Who's Upstairs scene, the Palmers were both kind of out of sync, like vocally too. There was that she talked about how the phone rang once and Harry asked when, and like she can't hear him. She hears she just says, I don't know who it was. And Hawk Leland says something a little bit off center too, where like, and instead of talking about the diary or anything, he basically asks him, do you have to take that, or do you have a key to this, is what Hawk asks him. And he says, do you have to take that? It's like there's just something just off from what's actually happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a theme that we'll see again in Fire Walk with Me as well.
Yeah.
Refusing to see, and also not responding to what has been said. This uncanny, again, disassociation of disconnection between them all, in a just slightly, again, just ever so slightly off way. Sometimes very obviously as well. And
sometimes happy accidents get to figure in too. With
absolutely
the reveal of Bob, it's a thing. Frank Silva was in the room, but like he was reflected in a mirror, and then reflected in the mirror that's like right above Sarah's head. So like Bob's right there the whole time, just like kind of haunting the scene too, almost like Laura. But
absolutely.
But the Red Room has a way of haunting.
Absolutely. And I think, something that is worth mentioning in this early stage is that the way I'll personally be reading Twin Peaks throughout, or attempting to, is from a Jungian perspective. And there was just something I wanted to share from a Redditor who put it perfectly, and his name's Jay-Z Communicate. So I will quote him here, and he says, Lynch talks about transcendental meditation and its influence on his work. He meditates and relies heavily on his unconscious and intuition for direction, often utilizing ideas and imagery that come to him in moments of inspiration, regardless of meaning and intention. Often he says he may not consciously understand how these ideas make sense in the narrative, but that he believes they are a part of a unified plane in which all ideas correspond, even if on an unconscious level. This is similar to Jung's theory of the collective unconscious, a part of our psyche that dates back to primordial psychic contents that are shared from all. From his collective unconscious, or from this collective unconscious, we inherit the archetypes, clusters of unconscious contents that guide all of our actions. We're influenced by these archetypes and by the level to which we develop them and the growth of our individual senses of self. You may have heard of archetypes such as the hero, the mother, the anima, animus, and of course the shadow. These represent aspects of ourself. For instance, the hero represents the part of us that develops our capabilities to rise up and face challenges. The mother is the part of us that seeks to nurture, and the shadow is the part of all of our psyches we choose to shun or repress, but that we project onto others as evil or horrible traits. When we dream of our shadows, we may dream of terrible figures who cause harm and torment us, chase us, abuse us. These are Bob-like figures, or can appear to us as evil doppelgangers. I'll quote him again when we start talking about season 3, when he talks about Cooper's Quest, because I very much enjoy how he sums this up. But I think you can clearly see both Lynch and Frost's interest in the esoteric and this Jungian idea of the collective unconscious. Twin Peaks is to me an archetype of the collective unconscious, because they all seem to know and experience things very connectedly, and there's always these echoes and shadows that seem to play out throughout the town in a way that's, slightly unusual. But it's great to see that even just in this pilot, the amount of times we've revisited watching this, people fans of the show, and you can see, through Laura's death becoming something that is seemingly felt and known without it being spoken about, is the clearest indication that we're looking at that something that is a Jungian idea of the collective unconscious.
Nice.
But yes, also I think the idea of the shadow is something that we'll see again played out again and again throughout the series. So maybe just little inklings of this in Mirrors, but we're going to be paying close attention to every time we see Mirrors throughout the series. And
hey kids, it's Don Shanahan from the Cinephile Hissy Fit, one of the podcasts on the Ruminations Radio Network. If you've been enjoying this show, come listen to Will Johnson and I fight it out over cinema's best and worst on the Cinephile Hissy Fit. Find us and all the great shows over on ruminationsradionetwork.com.
Now that we're back from break, from our host at the Ruminations Radio Network, other fine podcasts in our family, we are back, and we are here to ask the question, is Dale already in the Red Room? Because, obviously at this point in 1990, we would have no idea to even ask that question, but since season 3 is reframing everything, has Lynch and Frost reframed it so that Twin Peaks is essentially like some sort of dream state, or if Dale Cooper's always been kind of in there. Sometimes you hear, like, at the end of part 7, when Cooper got shot, has that been a dream? It's worth asking, like, from the get-go, especially since he's introduced with Dance of the Dream Man as his theme background.
Yeah. Agent Cooper's our guide into the Red Room and the dream state. He's like the sort of shaman that leads us into this other realm through his dreams. So there's that, coming up in the subsequent episodes, we'll see this new layer of reality that is on top of Twin Peaks. But you can't not ask the question, has the return changed everything entirely? Because as Philip Gerard says, I think the future dictates the past. So, what has come later in Twin Peaks has kind of reframed everything that we see in the original. To the point where we saw actual scenes, Pete never got to go fishing, and we saw actual scenes erased or changed, altered or reframed in a different way, and it's I think something that people struggle with. The fans of the original series, they feel like they don't want to look at it in a different way. They just want to enjoy the gentle rolling, relatively more gentle version of the original without that next chapter changing everything. But it does, I think. I think it's unavoidable. Like, you sort of end up in this Mobius strip of maybe just an eternal return of things looping around with Agent Cooper, our tragic hero.
Yeah, personally, I side on the side that there is a reality in Twin Peaks, and Cooper is firmly in that right now. But obviously, we'll be looking into that. But yeah, as of right now, before the Secret Diary came out, you kind of almost wonder if Laura created all this lodge stuff from her. Was it a masking mechanism for coping with PTSD involved in everything that happened to her? There's all sorts of questions about that. But then after the diary, you find out Bob's been here a while. After My Life, My Tapes, you find out that Dale got his gold pinky ring that he gave to the giant. He got that in his, I think it was his early teens or 20s, from his mom in a dream. And his mom happened to be dead at that time. So, I mean, you know, it's like there's all these connections, like, from a while ago, you know, within the universe. I mean, the Blue Rose Task Force existed before Philip Jeffries disappeared. We find out in Fire Walk With Me. And in Secret History, which I would consider absolute canon because it came from Mark Frost, and he and Lynch wrote the script together. Therefore, they, you know, they know what they were trying to say together with the new stuff. So I count Secret History, and the Owl Ring shows up as early as before the Lewis and Clark expedition. So the Lodge kind of has always been around in some capacity, and it's been interacting with the area of Twin Peaks since forever. So in theory, I could kind of see how people would consider it an ability to be all, you know, a dream, even with a reality standpoint. But, you know, I still can't buy that based on all the other characters that we see in this show.
Yeah, and I think that the beauty of Twin Peaks and a lot of other work by Lynch is this constant competing narrative, you know, these parallel realities that rub up against each other, and you're never quite sure, is it that or this, you know, and it's both a lot of the time. And that's part of why we're sat here today. Just, you know, you can dive into it from so many different angles and view it from so many different angles that you'll never fully be able to encapsulate the one way it is. So I think the answer probably is that yes, he is already in the Red Room, and no, he's not.
Yeah, there's this weird internal and external way of looking at things too. Like, you know, from a metaphor standpoint, It totally works.
Absolutely. Yeah. Is the Red Room just a metaphor for the dream space, or a metaphor for duality in our world, or, you know, is it quite a direct representation of spiritual beliefs held by Frost and Lynch, that there is a spirit realm and there is, you know, another occult, unseen layer to our reality? So I think, again, there's so many different ways of reading the Red Room. It's one of the most enduring parts of the series, I think. You know, otherwise you would just end up with a kind of kooky whodunit. With like lots of surrealism, and it'd be great, you know, it'd be wonderful. But this other layer that adds on top of it is like this never-ending, evolving mythology. And I think that's also, you know, part of what we will be exploring, is how the mythology's evolved over the time. And some of it's just, you know, really beautifully synchronistic and it just fits, but I don't know if it was always intended. So there's that as well, you know. What we're reading into it from a 2021 standpoint after season 3 is you know, there's multiple layers that have been added on top of the original text that just complicate things further, make it more fun as a result.
And yet, honestly, a lot of things are still there. I mean, you just got done talking about a Jungian perspective, and you know, it's like we see a bunch of Lynch's preoccupations right here too. Like, I know you wanted to talk about the Log Lady, like just introducing like the electricity concept.
Yeah, I mean, the Log Lady is another sort of shamanic figure, isn't she? She's someone that's holding space between two realms. She's not so much a dweller on the threshold, but maybe just a point between the seeable 3D reality, if you like, of just Twin Peaks, the town, and then this unknowable, unseeable, we actually do get to see it, but, underground kind of extra sensory experience of the place, and as the place as a sort of portal to the underworld. And then this theme of electricity, which I know has come up a lot in your writing about the original series, and this metaphor has been brought up by a lot of people that have theorized around it. The infamous nearly 5-hour Twin Peaks Explained video by Twin Perfect, where he extended that metaphor of electricity being really, really key in how he believes Lynch and Frost mapped everything out and coded everything. I'm not sure I can see them sitting down at this stage mapping out this code, but at the same time there are codes in there, and electricity is one of them, as this life force, and this electricity is the thing that's powering our brain and powering our dreams, powering our consciousness.
And then the log lady literally flicking the switch on and off, on and off. And really, that was her only job in the pilot.
Yeah, and she is arguably the first instance of the uncanny that we see, because it's just so odd to see a person walking around with a piece of tree in their hand. It's just, and you just never seen anything like that in this kind of genre. You might have seen something strange like that in a comedy, in a funny slapstick thing at that time on TV, but not walking into the scene on a whodunit. It's just like, what? Where am I? So she serves to just kind of disorientate everyone. And at that point she's a little bit of a laughingstock, but I think she gets her dues in terms of her status within the town and the show and the mythology later on. But literally flicking the switch from light to dark, that duality, and being someone that's understanding this occult use of energy, and she's awesome. I love her.
I do too. And she really brings literally light and darkness at the same time, in the meeting, excuse me. It's interesting just how everything's always kind of layered. I think even in the opening credits, there's an image of nature followed by an image of the logging factory, or the mill. And it's it coexists literally on top of each other the whole time. And and that's just kind of how I see the nature of reality in Twin Peaks, where there's this physical space, and then there's this internal space where it's the internal lodge space kind of thing tends to show up more as a delusion. It's like an influence of what you want, kind of showing. We see it within characters just in general about how they want the world to be, and they're kind of behaving almost like it is that already. And eventually, in some cases, it's how the credits fade from one to another. It's after a slow fade, it tends to become more real or less real, depending on where we're at. We can see that almost with the more the more involved with Twin Peaks as we get, like the more like Lodge stuff kind of takes hold, and it kind of changes Cooper's perception. Like right now, he thinks it's like a noir movie from back in the day, and he's just like like let's solve the crime, and like the more involved he gets, the more layers that land on him. It's almost like the fog of Twin Peaks that Tamara Preston talks about at the end of Final Dossier, which kind of comes and goes. Like it's like the longer Cooper stays in Twin Peaks, the more that reality kind of takes hold over him and becomes more and more real. And I think we see that like gradually, like from different people within Twin Peaks are either more or less influenced by this reality. Like like Margaret, she's already there, but we don't know why or how. We just know she looks kind of weird compared to everybody else. And there's a lot of delusion over Twin Peaks, like already. Like we see it with Johnny Horn for sure.
We certainly do, and I
yeah.
have some things to say about Johnny, because we need to talk about Johnny.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Something that we also want to explore in this series is the cinematic influences of Lynch in his work, and also possibly in the actual writing of it with Frost as well. Obviously Twin Peaks was this incredible movement in TV in a way, but it started a movement towards a more cinematic use of long form storytelling. But yeah, so I mean, we first meet Johnny in a very interesting way, which got me thinking about the links between Twin Peaks and Kubrick. And obviously there's this special relationship, let's say, this mutual respect that we know about between Lynch and Kubrick. The story goes that Kubrick actually said to Lynch as a young filmmaker that that Eraserhead was his favourite film.
Yeah.
Not favourite film at the time, his favourite film. This is what Lynch has been very careful to make sure we know. So there is this influence that you could potentially even say possibly we see in later Kubrick. I would argue maybe Eyes Wide Shut, but we won't go there for now. So yes, we need to talk about Johnny. We first see Johnny, we get this Hitchcockian sweeping waterfall shot of the Great Northern Hotel, which we'll see over and over. And we see Sylvia and Audrey sitting, sulking at the table within their home. We hear a discombobulating knocking or beating sound in the other room. Is it a piece of machinery or something else? Then we cut to a shot of Johnny Horn in his room upstairs. He's wearing a Native American headdress, possibly of the Nez Perce tribe, and knocking his head monotonously on a doll's house. This uncanny shot of the proportions of Johnny and this doll's house and the headdress, all very strange. The parallels that spring to mind for me that can't be ignored come from Lynch and Frost's Great Northern Hotel and Kubrick's Overlook Hotel of his 1977 film The Shining. For those of us who've subsequently learnt about Twin Peaks' more meta story, there's cancellations, criminally berated prequels and all the rest. But that pilot would be Lynch's triumph in fusing film and TV in this blurring of the mediums and moods and scale. Native American trauma is widely believed to be coded pretty heavily in The Shining. That's one of the major theories about the film. We see fairly explicit use of Native American artwork in the hotel. We see shots of Jack, Wendy, and Danny in front of certain Native American artwork, or the cans, the Calumet cans with an indigenous tribal chief clad in a mohawk in behind Jack. We hear the hotel manager say that the hotel was built on a native Indian burial ground, which became this trope, often seen in Stephen King, but became a bit of a trope later on as well. So there's this sense of collective trauma and collective pain that I think it's not too much of a leap to say that the Great Northern has a little bit of the Overlook Hotel within it. I mean, just ask Josie, who ends up haunting a doorknob eventually. But I'll be looking for Kubrickian Easter eggs throughout the entirety of Twin Peaks, and just looking out for that tonally, stylistically. Like I say, I think the two directors borrowed a little bit from each other in a fanboy, slightly Jung and Freud kind of way. Even just in the pilot, we get some really lovely shots of the morgue, the school, that are from this famous three-point perspective shot that Kubrick was famous for. But yeah, back to Johnny Horn. He's a bit of a tragic figure. We see him in the season 3 10th episode, which we'll talk about later on, which brings to mind a different Kubrick work, possibly brings to mind A Clockwork Orange, with Richard Horn in a terrible scene of assault. But yeah, I would argue that there's a little touch of The Shining in The Great Northern, even though it seems cozy and there's lots of firesides, and you know we're lulled into a false sense of security in Twin Peaks constantly because it's such a seducing, cozy town. You know, you just want to go there for a holiday, even though you know some dark things happen there.
Yeah.
So I think we could be looking out for some parallels between the Overlook and the Great Northern as we go on. And Johnny Horn, I think, is another potential example of someone who lives between two worlds. And I think this is something that comes up again and again with Twin Peaks, as madness or mental illness, or, you know, perhaps someone even on the spectrum. We don't know what Johnny Horn's problems are. But he seems to understand this collective trauma that's underneath the surface of Twin Peaks in a way that his, you know, higher functioning sister and mother and father, who are just living in the, you know, what is seen world, do not understand.
Yeah, while Sylvia and Audrey are just like staring straight ahead and leaving it to Jacoby to like stop him from banging his head. Like, I don't know. There's a lot of neglect there, but it's almost like it's almost like they're feeding into the fact that Johnny's just not quite in the same frequency as everybody else. I mean, he's sort of attached to what we'll find out later is like this big statement on colonialism that that Frost and I you know, Lynch, but definitely Frost puts into Secret History of Twin Peaks. But it's also, we find out, oh man, I can't remember if it's a deleted scene or not, but Audrey mentions how Johnny had a head injury when he was a kid. And, you know, like head injuries with Lynch is a big theme just in general. But in this case, like, not only does he have that, he's got a disguise over him. And like we were talking about with Josie and, you know, painting a face over her face. You know, it's like all the people that seem a little bit off all have like a weird thing that we're just not going to see in anybody else. And, you know, Johnny, like he makes his obvious that like he kind of almost... There's like this kinship with this culture that just got completely sublimated by the settlers, the people that formed Twin Peaks.
Yeah, or as Jack Torrance in The Shining would call, the white man's burden.
Yeah.
There's definitely some pretty strong overtones of colonialism and the effects. You know, unfortunately, we only really see Hawk representing indigenous culture. We see,
Yeah.
I think, one other indigenous American in the series. I think a lady later on who's showing Cooper
Yeah.
around a cottage.
Yeah,
but
Irene
yeah.
bringing her to the dog farm.
But you know, the Great Northern is just so in the style of Native American artwork. It seems to me, you know, like Ben Horn's office is just completely clad in
Yeah.
tapestries. It just seems to me too neat a connection.
Yeah.
And
the
you
Blue
can just
Pine
find
Lodge,
so many
too.
nice little connections, like the scene in The Shining where Jack is having an interview with the hotel manager. There's actually a copy of Jung's Red Book quite clearly in the shot on the side.
Nice.
And that was written while Jung was in the midst of allegedly a psychotic break, and detailed ahead of its time theories on hypnagogic states and states between consciousness and unconsciousness, hallucinations. And I think we see this collective conscious trauma in Twin Peaks so clearly. It's like a character almost in the town. But you get characters like Margaret who can master that and articulate it and knowingly live between those states. And then you get the collateral damage of more vulnerable characters, perhaps like Laura or Johnny Horn, who are, you know, Nadine, who are
Yes.
touched by this knowing of collective pain, but they haven't got the capacity or knowledge to actually understand that they're tapping into something bigger than themselves.
Yeah. And living in Twin Peaks, like, it's kind of hard to know. Like, you know, like, when your situation, like, if you live in, like, Nebraska, you understand, like, what a really cold, strong winter is going to be like, you know, like but if you're from California, you're just never going to really understand, like, how to, you know, drive a car in winter, even. Like, it's like there's these situational things that, like, if you grow up in Twin Peaks, like, it's just going to be weird. And
It's just going to be weird.
but the weirdness isn't weird because, you know, you almost, like, instinctively know how to navigate it.
And then, yes, you've got, like we said before, you've got the way of reading it as this is literal spirits and lodge spirits working, or then you've got the symbolic, metaphorical way of reading it where, you know, Johnny's just had a head injury and isn't well. But there does seem to be a theme throughout of the characters that have been touched by mental illness or trauma having much more of a connection to that unseen realm.
Yeah, it seems like the people who are able to believe in their wants more than their needs tend to be touched by this. Tend to be touched by a lodge space, and then wants and needs become a huge focal point for things as we go on too.
Absolutely.
You know, beyond a scene with Audrey and Cooper.
Yeah. But I would argue that I think although Johnny Horn is definitely a background character, this introduction to him is so laden with some symbolism.
Yes.
And even just having him looking down on a doll's house, which would, you know, having a perspective of this symbol of a family home, you know, a safe place, and knocking his head against it with trauma to suggest that the family home isn't as safe as we are led to believe.
Yeah. Going on with this wants and needs sort of idea, I tend to think that the Twin Peaks lodge space is a frequency more than anything else. And there's like a range of frequency that we see especially come out in season 2, where there's like this dichotomy between love and fear. So we have, I would say, like, Johnny Horn would be kind of falling under like a frequency of fear-based stuff because he is disconnected. It's almost like he lives in that little house that's like completely cordoned off from everything else. And like we'll see it with characters like Nadine in the future, and even Josie's somehow caught up in it. We'll find out with her final scenes.
Audrey later on as
yeah.
well, confined to a house.
Yeah, and it seems
Living
like
in
it
trauma.
shows up, like, maybe not all the time, but like Nadine, she's almost in like a love-based delusion so she can heal. And there's all these things that we'll see that, it's like the dream or the lodge space. It's not exactly positive or negative, it's both, but it is disconnected from reality.
Well, is it though? Or is it showing us and the characters the true reality?
Yeah.
Showing the characters their shadow? And
Well, yeah. Yeah, it's more like the internal reality that's like the internal reality that you use to navigate the physical reality. It's something more along those lines. I don't know if I can there's a lot of new. I'm sure it'll come out over the years with how I can explain it piece by piece, but I think right now we're okay. So Donna was recast in Fire Walk with Me, but it's a physical representation in a town where the worldview can be actually seen in a way that I was just describing, where like the internal is kind of being expressed through the external, or the internal becomes external because of all the lodge space portals and whatever else you would like to say. And the strangest thing is that because Laura Flynn Boyle didn't want to come back for Fire Walk with Me, yet Donna was an integral character, we can...
So actually she didn't want to come back? Or she wasn't? I thought she wasn't invited.
No, she was, but there was... the word is that she had another movie, kind of like how Sherilyn Fenn also had like a scheduling conflict. And, it's like whatever you want to believe about, why else she didn't want to come or whatever, that's the official reason. And, so we're left with Moira Kelly and Lara Flynn Boyle both being Donna. And because of this weird state of reality that Twin Peaks is, it's worth considering, like, was there something between Fire Walk with Me and this original Twin Peaks that actually changed physically Donna?
Good. I mean, it's definitely a good line of inquiry, because we see even in the original season, come season 2, Donna is suddenly morphing into Laura.
Yeah.
And you could argue that Moira Shelley, who they cast as the Fire Walk with Me version of Donna, is so much sweeter and gentler and more innocent looking, and the way she plays Donna is that, you can just see her being one of the Hayward sisters, whereas I think as Donna progresses through the original run, she becomes like this kind of femme fatale vamp figure. So it's almost like she's changing throughout, and I think that was intentional. I think that was definitely part of what was written into Fire Walk with Me, is that Laura didn't want Donna to follow in her footsteps and become like her.
Yeah.
But obviously with Laura herself, we get her appearing as Maddie. We get various instances of people being different, appearing differently. We get Catherine appearing as a man at one point in terrible, slightly offensive drag.
Yeah.
But so I think what's great about Twin Peaks is something, that's a behind the scenes problem that our actress can't come back for the prequel when we're scheduled to make this film, does fit with the way the series works with with how slippery characters are. You know, who are they? And that is a very Lynchian, you know, stalwart of his canon is people can be two different people at the same time. They can appear completely differently, and you can't really say.
Yeah, and it's an interesting debate. Everybody's always like, "Who's the better Donna?" And like,
I know.
At this point, it's almost like, which one's the real one?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's an Erin's Fool trying to answer that.
Yeah, but I'll throw one out there. I think that the Donna we get in Fire Walk with Me is, and Laura is probably a strong sender. You can see how I could get there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that the Moira Kelly Donna is probably more along the lines of the Donna that Laura wants her to be. And like we can see later on when she wears the sunglasses and everything, you know, don't wear my stuff. You know, it's like if Laura needs Donna to be such and such a person, like, are you my friend? Like that big wake up scene at the end where like, you know, Laura is just realizing that the Leland and Bob are connected. The first thing she does is run over to Donna and say, "Are you my friend?" And I almost think that you can make a case that that moment for Donna, that was her wake up. Like, you know, it's like, am I her friend? You know, it's like, am I really her friend, or am I just the friend that she wants me to be?
That's a really interesting point, actually. I think, yeah, you're right. I think in Fire Walk with Me, we're seeing Laura's version of events. It's from her perspective. So, yeah, it follows that the Donna that we see is soft and innocent and a safe, you know, maybe the kind of girl that Laura wishes she could be if she hadn't had her innocence taken away from her. And I think that's a good point, because we, you know, what we know of Donna's story post the season, out of the, you know, confines of what we see on screen within Secret History, Donna's trajectory follows more of a Laura-esque trajectory than the Donna we see in Fire Walk with Me. You know, she ends up. You'll have to help me out. How does she end up? I know she's not great. Goes to New York.
Something along those lines. Yeah, she kind of like dates celebrities and all that, but then at the end she finally finds herself and settles down with her dad as a doctor, like basically helping, whether she like becomes a nurse or whatever. Like she ends up helping with her dad's practice at the end.
I'm glad she ends up happy. That makes me happy. I thought it was a bit of a sad story. But we'll get to that in the Secret History of Twin Peaks. Yeah,
all in due time. But I kind of think that because she and Sarah and Leland were basically the three main people that understood that Laura died before anybody said anything, I feel like she's so connected to that like at this point she doesn't know who she is yet. You know, she's going to try on being a vamp. She's going to try on being, you know, like an investigator with James. She's going to try this and that. And like, you know, like she's going to find herself over the course of the next, you know, however many years you want to count, all the way through the end of Final Dossier. And like, it's almost like we're seeing Donna beginning her actual investigation of herself in her Lara Flynn Boyle incarnation.
Yeah, and I think she takes on a lot of Laura's traits because she misses her and she's grieving, and that's another way that Laura's ghost sort of lives.
Yeah.
Is through her, which I think is quite an accurate depiction of grief in a way.
Yeah. And there's another way that we kind of see her breaking out, and we see it a lot in this in the pilot episode, there's a whole bunch of these secret relationships, these places under the surface. It's almost like another way of what you're saying about the internal and the external selves. Like the people who are maybe afraid of like what the world's going to think of them, they find a safe place where they can be honest with themselves. Like we see it with Ed and Norma, where they finally talk about their, like how they really feel about each other. And we see it with James and Donna for sure. Because like when they finally come clean in that one dark scene where they're burying the necklace, it's like we hear about all kinds of stuff about Laura, and like, even how she said that Bobby told her he killed a guy. And it's like all these truths are finally coming out with each other, and they finally get to catch up with like their reactions about Laura dying even. And it's like once they express their fears about all that, then the first thing they figure out is that they're really into each other. It's almost like being vulnerable allows them to become closer.
Yeah.
And honestly, that even works with like Josie and Harry. It's like Josie, like she's obviously affected by the Laura thing, and Leslie Lincoln Glatter, one of the directors of the series, she's convinced that Josie actually really likes Harry. So I'll take that as a as a point in my favor for that one. But it's like Josie feels safe with Harry, and it's the only time she can admit that she's afraid.
Yeah. But yeah, it's a theme that we'll see throughout of this soap opera element of secrets and lies and affairs and people presenting a mask to the world, and then there's a sort of reality underneath. So we are nearly nearing the end of this first episode, looking at the pilot of Twin Peaks, and we asked a screenwriter who had never seen Twin Peaks to give us her hot take. So this is a quote from Emma DeVette, screenwriter of Glass House, which just premiered in London at the Sci-Fi Film Festival, and her feelings after watching the pilot of Twin Peaks as a Twin Peaks virgin. The first episode of Twin Peaks is both snug and unsettling. It feels exactly like semantic satiation. Say a word too many times and it becomes a sound. It's the familiar and nostalgic made strange. The dialogue is recognizable as trite family drama or crime procedural, but it's stripped back and left slightly off kilter. It functions so perfectly as a formulaic genre show that at a script level, it's almost impossible to see how he's doing it. How something so structurally standard on the page is being transmuted into something so strange on screen. It's like coming back to find the furniture in your room rearranged just slightly. Everything belongs, but something's not quite right. So thank you, Emma, for your hot take on the pilot of Twin Peaks. We will be asking for her opinion later down the line as she progresses with her own Twin Peaks journey.
All right, and all that remains to be said is you have been listening to the Blue Rose Task Force podcast, a production of Ruminations Radio Network and TV Obsessive Radio.
Yes, and if you resonate with what you're hearing, please do subscribe, rate, review our show, and if you're watching this on YouTube, you know what to do. Hit the subscribe button and the alarm bell. We'd love to also connect with you on Twitter at BlueRoseTFPod and Instagram and Facebook at simply Blue Rose Task Force.
You can find me at JPB_LittleGreen on Twitter and John_the_Peaky on Instagram.
And you can find me on both Twitter and Instagram at E11eSounds.
Visit RuminationsRadioNetwork.com for additional great shows such as Retro Futures Culture and Cinephile Hissy Fits.
And find any number of classic 25 years later Twin Peaks articles and content on many other TV shows and music at tvobsessive.com.
If you want to be part of our monthly mailbag Patreon episodes, send your burning questions and passionate feedback to bluerosetaskforcepodcast@gmail.com.
We'll see you next week as we cover episode 1, the second overall episode of Twin Peaks.
And until then, listeners, I'll see you in my
It's a way to kind of
dreams.
deepen and expand the universe that the show takes place in. They'll really dig it. This is a gift to all the fans.